It's a delight to see everyone today. It's cool, crispy weather. Enjoying that this morning. I particularly like the part about no bugs. Whenever a new pastor is transferred to serve a new congregation, it's customary for the minister to give an icebreaker sermon. I suppose the term icebreaker is a northern term, and I suspect that the term icebreaker was derived from the wintertime practice when it was important for a farmer to chop a hole in the ice so his livestock could get water. And an icebreaker sermon is similar in the rhetorical sense that it's intended to break through barriers to communication so that a minister can bring the spiritual water of Jesus Christ to the congregation. Well, I'm not exactly new to all of you, or perhaps any of you. This is my first Sabbath as a pastor of the Northwest congregation in Arkansas, so I thought I would follow tradition and bring an icebreaker sermon to you. Meanwhile, I've entitled this message, Four Principles of Leadership. Four Principles of Leadership. After all, I have certain ecclesiastical responsibilities for the congregation, and it's understandable you would like to know what kind of leadership you can expect from me and what I would expect with you. And I chose this topic, the principles of leadership, for my initial pastoral sermon because I want to dispel some myths about real leadership and leave us with four essential points to remember about leadership. We cannot and will not cover the entire subject in 45 minutes. There are many books and articles, perhaps even encyclopedias full of leadership information, but we will cover two don'ts, and then we'll cover two do's regarding leadership, the four principal takeaways from today's message. But first, a little bit of my biography. Well, you can tell by my lack of a rich southern drawl that I'm not a native of Arkansas. I was born and raised on a brown Swiss cattle dairy farm in a German farming community in south central Minnesota. I'm the second son of four boys. I don't suppose my parents exactly planned to have four sons born in 5 years, but as a little kid, these kinds of family planning things really didn't occur to me. Just most of the neighbor kids' farms all had four boys in them too, and girls were those strange and wonderful creatures that came from somewhere else we really didn't know much about. My great-grandfather, Martens, homesteaded the home farm that's in the family yet today. I attended the same one-room country schoolhouse that my grandfather attended when he was a little boy over 100 years ago. My mother later became the young country school teacher who was sent to that one-room country schoolhouse where she met and married the dashing young farmer in the neighborhood who became my dad. Later, the country school was consolidated with the nearby town school district, and when that country school contents were sold at auction, my father purchased half of the library. I did not know as a kid that it was such a tiny, tiny library. It looked to me like it was just the most wondrous thing ever. It was just all these books. And as an adult, there was just a couple of little shelves of books, but it really was very exciting at the time. As a youth, then, I grew up in that rural community. I was heavily involved in 4-H and FFA. I went on to the city high school, the same high school that my dad had gone to, because the rural schools didn't have high schools, only the cities did. And many years later, in fact, I had 6 of the same high school teachers my dad had. We were 25 years apart in high school, so when it came time for my 25th high school reunion, my dad rode along with me because it was his 50th, and we both went along together. And he went to his 50th anniversary party, and I went to my 25th. Many of the students in my class had parents who were in his graduating class, so it seemed like he knew everybody. Just couldn't get away with anything because he just knew them all. When I got out of high school, the Vietnam War was still going on in full steam, and at age 17, I was too young to be drafted by selective service. But for some reason, when I turned 18, the selective service missed me. They just didn't get around to calling me, could very well have, because I didn't have a reason not to go. I was the second of 4 sons. Well, that only son part provision was out. I wasn't needed on the farm. There were plenty of other brothers there, and there was just no reason. They just couldn't have snatched me and sent me off. And it was only later that they had the lottery came up where I was able to get a lottery number, and I drew number 174. I always remember the number. In fact, everybody who was in the draft lottery remembers their number, I'm sure. And I drew 174, and I watched, and they drafted up to 130, and then they stopped. They had filled their quota. Well, I got by that way at that time. Well, growing up home on the farm, we listened to the radio while we were milking cows and doing chores, feeding cows. And the Deep Voices of the World Tomorrow broadcast came on. And they would be playing on several stations. You turn from one, and then when that half hour was over, you turn to another station, and another one was over. And so the cows were well educated, we'll put it that way. We didn't know that there was a church that was connected to the radio broadcast. We just knew there was a college and a broadcast. My mom subscribed to the Plain Truth magazine. She taught Methodist Church Sunday School with it for 10 years. My mom was a hoarder. She still is. Hi, Mom, if you're out there. She didn't throw anything away. She stored all those Plain Truth magazines, put them in boxes, and hauled them out to an outbuilding, actually the granary. One day, as a 16-year-old, my brother discovered boxes of Plain Truth magazines out in the granary, and he started reading. Hey, this goes together with the radio that we've been hearing. Well, it didn't take long, and he wanted to attend Ambassador College, and he wanted to quit eating unclean meats, and he wanted to keep the Sabbath. As you can imagine, that kind of stirred up the household a bit. I was curious, but I wasn't convicted yet. I didn't find the magazines. In fact, my parents threw them out as soon as my brother got interested and expressed his desire to do these, keep the Sabbath and change his diet. After my brother went on to a local college, they said, no, you can't go out of state off to California to some other school. You stay at home. Vietnam war is going, but you don't have to go to the university because, all the bad stuff going on there. So you go to this Baptist college named Bethel College in St. Paul, Minnesota. So he went there. And later I found out he had studied his brains out in order to get good grades because he wanted to transfer to California. And indeed he did. He got good grades and transferred to California. Well, he's a year ahead of me. Now I'm going off to college, and I just follow in Brother's footsteps, and I went to the same Baptist college. Now, we're not Baptists. Okay, the family wasn't, but it was a safe place because the university had lots of protests going on. Helicopters from the National Guard were dropping tear gas canisters, and Kent State students who were getting shot from the rioting, and it was a safer environment. Never told my parents that there were 5 girls for every 2 boys for the ratio at that school, but it was a good school. They were very polite, very nice, and I think well of the school. I worked at home on the farm during college breaks, and one summer I worked at a dairy research farm in another city. Job started at 4:10 a.m. I can't forget that one either. Another summer I painted houses, and I went to summer school in the Twin Cities, and that's an experience there, just painting houses in the big city. During the winter break of my junior year in college, I decided to visit my brother who was attending college in Pasadena, California. So off I went, took an airplane, went out there, and I was amazed. There were palm trees, green grass. It was a deserty, warm desert, and that was cold and blowy and snowy where I'd come from. It was like another world. I had no idea. Just no real life experience to realize that could be so. It looked like all the trees looked like telephone poles with a few floppy leaves on the top. It was amazing. You could walk around without a jacket on. Well, they wore jackets, but I sure didn't. It was remarkable. My school let out a week or 10 days before his, so I went to class with my brother every day. Got to sit in on Ambassador College classes. Took a lot of notes. It was really quite interesting. And so he was taking 4th year Bible, so there was a lot of heavy duty notes that were coming. Imagine it was like hearing bits and pieces of sermonettes all day long, okay, in several of his classes. It was like, the class lasted an hour, you'd get the equivalent of 3 or 4 sermonettes of a specific subject. And I was taking notes, and indeed, it was 6 months later when a graduate of that year who was in the class as a senior was sent out to Minnesota as a student or as a ministerial assistant, and I could follow my notes because I took that notebook to church, and he was giving sermonettes right out of that notebook. Just a lot of good material there. My brother came to visit after I had went home, and he picked him up on a Thursday night, and he said, I can get a ride home to the farm, which is 80 miles, about 80 miles away, if you'll take me to church, and then some people from church can take me home. I said, okay. So I went to church with him that Sabbath. I knew where it was, I knew what time it was, and I took him to church. And then after church, I went back to my apartment, went back to college. The next week, though, I said, I know where it is now. I know what time it is. Nobody told me that you had to have permission to go to church or you had to ask, something. I just didn't know anything about that. So I just drove in like I owned the place, walked in, followed other people in and sat down. And my brother was practically dropped his teeth out when he saw me. What in the world are you doing there? Nobody, it was really a shock for him. He couldn't believe I'd actually gone there on my own. And then continued on with church at that time. I was baptized a little over a year later. Went to my first feast that fall. I had $35 in my pocket and went to the feast. Somebody lent me a tent, and I went camping in a tent. And it was such a delightful feast, and I didn't have it in my notes, but I remember it so clearly. I never knew you could go step out of a tent with a coat and a tie on. And they gave me a ride there. They gave me a ride back, and it was really a remarkable experience. People treated me wonderfully, and I came home with $31. I was just shocked. It was just a church cultural experience. I was a little over a year after I came as the spring of '74, and you can do the math. I was a senior in college. I was baptized by a young minister who was newly assigned to that area, young minister named Victor Kubik. I knew his mom and I knew his siblings. Goes back a way. I think his little brother was like 12 years old or something at the time. After college, I went to work for a company called Land O'Lakes. Some of you may be familiar with Land O'Lakes butter and such. That was the same company. I worked for a different division in the state of Iowa. In fact, there's still friends in the church that I met way back in 1974 and 75, and I can't believe that it's over 40 years ago, and we can still chat just like it was the other day. I got the bright idea I should start farming on my own. So I left the big company. I rented some farmland, got some machinery from my dad and some neighbors, and I started farming. Did it for 3 years. However, I figured out the economics of farming was that I could either pay for the farm or I could eat, but I couldn't do both. And since I really like to eat, and I didn't want to let go of the farm, I took a job then as a manager of a dairy research station in Fargo, North Dakota. It was an exciting opportunity because it had academic environment and it was an agricultural world. And I got to build a brand new research station at the same time as operating the existing one with a staff of about 12 to 15. It was very exciting, very exciting time. And when that project was all done, I was so excited about new projects, I wanted to go out and find another new project to do. So I up and moved, packed everything, and went to Oregon. And I had some in-laws in Oregon, and there decided, well, the next new opportunity was I'd build a company. So I went from the trunk to the garage to a commercial facility of about 1,500 square feet. And within a few years, it was over an 11,000 square foot building, and it was a dominant kind of industrial distribution company in the state. So things grew rather fast in a recessionary time. Had I known the economics of the nation at the time, I would have never done something so foolish. I helped teach a class at the community college called The Introduction to Going into Business. I guess I didn't have that in my notes either. And I remember that class is what we did is the first 3 hours. It was met 3 hours once a week. And we put down all the reasons that businesses fail and put them up on the board. It took about 3 hours. We figured if it would, there's usually a full classroom, 30, 40 people. And if that didn't scare anybody off, if they came the next week, then they might be okay. They might survive. But it spent about 3 hours of how to fail. And I realized with horror, after we had gone through the first 3 hours, I'd made every one of those mistakes, except for the illegal ones. And I might have done the illegal ones, except that I just didn't even know it. I mean, there's just some things, they make laws you just don't even know. Built the company took about a dozen years, and then sold it to a competitor, a larger competitor, and I stayed on another 15 months to merge the companies together. And then went on to Los Angeles, where I worked for one of the vendors, a big company in Los Angeles. And that was, each job was always very exciting. I don't know why that is. Each step of the way was. And I got to know different church people in different states. So I went on to Southern California, and there I commuted by a lot from Oregon to California, and half my time was east of the Mississippi. So I was putting on about 10,000 air miles a month. And so it was a very busy job. It was a lot of fun. Got to know Robin Weber, who was the minister at Imperial PM at the time. In fact, he took one of my daughters on a Grand Canyon youth trip. Um, over the years, I've had a chance to visit different church congregations. I've had attended 3 different ones in Minnesota. People used to ask me, where do you go to church? And I tell them I go to the Potluck Church of God. They look at me funny. Say, well, let's see, I'm 72 miles actually from Minneapolis South, Minneapolis North, and Mankato. I'm 80 miles from St. Paul and 60 miles from St. Cloud. And if you figure it just right, I'm 200 miles from Fargo, North Dakota, Fargo-Moorhead. So I said, it depends on the potluck schedule. When I was a young fellow, a bachelor, I said, I attend the Potluck Church of God. And if you worked it right and you knew the schedules, they worked out really, really well. I've been, and many of you who've been around the church for a while, I know what Toastmasters and Spokesman's Club is. I spent over 15 years in Spokesman's Club, went through all of those things there, and then I got out of there and I missed it so much I joined Toastmasters to see what the community type one, and it's very similar. Why I'm in Arkansas? Well, I married Arkansas. What I mean is that my future wife, Linda, already lived in Arkansas, so when we married, I moved here. My wife and I have a blended family of 9 children, and we're raising number 10, which is our eldest grandson, who's now a college freshman. My maternal grandmother was born and raised just a few miles from here in Gravette, Arkansas. I have a bunch of shirt-tail relatives around these woods, and I still have the farm in Minnesota and like to get there once in a while in the summertime if I can. My mother and I have lives there and some other family members. My wife and I are both high school teachers. Fortunately, I married someone smarter than me, so I can have somebody to help me look good. Before I was born, my dad was a sergeant in the National Guard, and when the Korean War broke out, he was drafted from the Guard into the Army. My dad was assigned to be a staff sergeant because he could use a typewriter, which was kind of a chuckle. I had to laugh when I first found it out because we had the same typing teacher in high school. After the first day in class, she comes back and says, did your dad graduate in about 1945 or so? Okay, yes, he did. Okay. On the farm, I saw that my dad knew how to organize projects and carry them out very quickly. He had 4 teenage sons. He didn't bark out orders. Instead, he explained what needed to be done. And then he took the initiative to get started doing things. He gave us hints, and we're expected to use our own initiative to get those things done. So he taught us personal responsibility. I remember Dad saying 90% of getting anything done is getting started. I saw firsthand what leadership was like in our family. Dad set the expectations and then allowed us the room to accomplish the task that was set before us. This meant we were also free to fail. And that was a scary thought, failure. Because failing meant you had to do even more work to fix up whatever you messed up with. And it didn't take long to figure out it was a whole lot easier to do it right the first time than it was to have to fix it up later. So now I want to jump into the 4 principles of leadership. So first of all, we have the 2 don'ts of leadership. Leadership principle number 1. Don't be a stumbling block. And leadership principle number 1, don't be a stumbling block. In Leviticus 19, verse 14, we first hear this mentioned. In Leviticus 19:14, you shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God. I am the Lord. Well, I'm fortunate. I have my eyesight, and even with good eyesight, any of us can still trip over things by accident from time to time. Well, how terrible it would be to deliberately place something in front of a person who could see, even worse, somebody who could not see. To the person that falls down, it doesn't really matter if the stumbling block was placed there deliberately or by mistake. The results are the same. We're instructed in Leviticus 19, verse 14, not to put a stumbling block in front of others. The underlying principle here, and we read that later in the verse, is that we must respect and fear God, who made us all potential members of the God family. We must take part to avoid deliberately hurting another family member. The instructions in Leviticus 19:14 are followed up then by the writings of Isaiah the prophet in Isaiah 57, verse 14. In Isaiah 57, verse 14. And one shall say, heap it up, prepare the way, take the stumbling block out of the way of my people. Ooh, so we can have a stumbling block in front of us that could be a problem. You see, sometimes a stumbling block is not just placed in front of one person, but it can be in front of a group of people. As the prophet Isaiah says, it's our job to remove the stumbling blocks or barriers. Well, this principle of not being a stumbling block is reiterated by Jesus Christ and recorded in the books of Matthew, Luke, and Mark. There are 3 sets of words that are used to express the concept of not being a stumbling block in front of others. In Matthew 18, verse 6, Jesus Christ warned, whoever called, and this was when the little children were coming to him and they were being held back by disciples. In Matthew 18:6, Jesus says, whoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me to sin, this is the New King James, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Ooh, that's pretty strong. Christ refers to little ones when he admonishes everyone not to lead these children such that they sin. Don't cause them, don't put them in a difficult predicament. The little ones Christ refers to can mean actual children, but it can also refer to those who are children or new in the faith. We read about those who are new in the faith if we return to 1 Peter 2. In 1 Peter 2 and verse 2, where we read that the children are referred to as new babes, spiritual children, who need the milk of the word, meaning spiritual milk. So in 1 Peter 2:2, we pick up the verse, pick it up and says, as newborn babes, desire the pure milk of the word that you may grow thereby. Because just like every baby wants to be fed, and certainly will hear the noise if they aren't fed, is babies desire physical milk, so as spiritual babies should and do desire milk of the word, which is one of the reasons we're doing the Bible study today. That's a pretty basic item, because people desire the milk of the word. We all start out as babies in human life. We start out as spiritual babies in our spiritual lives. And milk is a good thing. It's essential for early growth. And so spiritual milk is important for our early spiritual lives. There's another reference to spiritual babes in Hebrews 5 and verse 13. In Hebrews 5 and verse 13. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. Well, it does take time for babies to grow, and then they crawl, and then they walk. And it takes time for young ones to learn to talk. At some point, babies begin to eat solid food. And this, and it's the same with growing Christians. We learn a little bit at a time. We learn more and more. Ultimately, we all become teachers of the truths of God. We certainly don't throw steaks in front of a little baby who doesn't have the teeth or the digestive system to be able to digest it. When a baby is learning to walk, we don't put stumbling blocks in front of the little ones. We guide our babies with loving hands. We show them the way. Just as we read in Matthew 18:6, we're instructed to avoid causing others to sin. Then there's the next reference to stumbling block that's in the New Testament, in Mark. In Mark, in chapter 9 and verse 42. In Mark 9, verse 42. But whoever causes one of these little ones, there's the little ones again, who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. So whereas Matthew said, whoever causes someone to sin, it would have that same result. In Mark, he says, believe in me, causing them to stumble. So stumble, Mark uses the term to stumble, equating the terminology with what the writer Matthew's use of the term to sin. And then there's the third reference in the book of Luke that carries forward the same thought in Luke 17 and verse 2. In Luke 17 and verse 2, in these parallel gospels, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea than he should offend one of these little ones. So we've got 3 terms to help our understanding: to sin, to stumble, or to cause to be offended. Now, just to be sure that we understand the importance of not placing a stumbling block in front of someone to cause them to sin or needlessly cause them to suffer offense, we're reminded of Paul's letter to the Romans. So let's turn to Romans 14 and verse 13. And I'm going to look at this expression in Romans 14:13 in 4 different translations. Because each one of them words it very different, very slightly differently, but it gives us an angle on understanding this. So in Romans 14, in verse 13, in Paul's letter to the Romans, therefore let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or cause to fall in our brother's way. Sounds like he's been reading the Gospels, doesn't it? Then we read, that's the New King James Version. If we read it in the New English translation, they're taking these Greek words, and we end the sentence with, determine never to place an obstacle or trap before a brother or a sister. That's the New English translation. So they don't use the word stumbling block or cause to fall. They put an obstacle or a trap. We're getting that same idea coming across. Let's go to the English Standard Version. Decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. So don't hinder them. Don't slow them down. And then there's the Complete Jewish Bible. Not to put a stumbling block or snare in a brother's way. Now, a snare is something that's deliberately set that can trap them. The Pharisees and others tried to trap Christ. Okay, so a snare. I know in the forest you can put a snare out to catch a rabbit or other vermin. Well, actually, I don't know if a rabbit is vermin or not, but you can snare them or build snares, and that's a deliberate thing. So in other words, they're using all of these terms, whether it's on purpose or carelessness. Now, in the enterprises or jobs that I've been involved in life, I've had an opportunity to be a supervisor. And I don't say that I was the most talented person in being able to perform all of the functions for the company or enterprise. I had to learn to get out of the way so that those who were the most talented for those particular jobs could do it without me being a speed bump or a roadblock. I saw a bumper sticker in a car that simply stated, lead, follow, or get out of the way. That's sort of like our point 1 here. Don't be a stumbling block. True leadership is following that principle. Don't be a stumbling block to others. Just as a doctor is obligated under the Hippocratic Oath to do his patient no harm, each of us as individual leaders must take care to avoid being a problem for others, to avoid causing others to stumble or sin, or to avoid causing offense to others. And it works both ways. Those who are leaders must make every effort not to cause others to stumble, and because we're all children before God, all of us must make every effort to not to cause those who are leaders to stumble. And we've seen that a lot over the years, where some of them have also stumbled. It reminds me of the statement that sometimes leadership is like a bottle. The bottleneck is always at the top of the bottle. So the essence of leadership principle number 1 is do not be a stumbling block. Then there's a second don't. On leadership principle number 2, the second don't. Don't lord it over the brethren as the Gentiles do. Do not lord it over the brethren as the Gentiles do. We're going to take a look at Matthew 20 in verse 25. In Matthew 20, verse 25. And Jesus called to him and said, you know the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. Verse 27, and whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. I said that in the King James, but that word servant, you know how it comes off in the New English translation or the Common English version or the Complete Jewish Bible? It's all translated slave. Nobody told me that word when they got into this business, when they told me I had this function. But basically that's what it is. Leadership becomes a service. It becomes a servant. Or in this case, we are a slave. And in this case, we're a slave for Christ. Whereas in the rest of the world, of course, when you're in leadership, your job is to serve and serve well. Now, I've worked with some interesting bosses, and I'm sure that some of you have some remarkable stories to tell about the people whom you have worked for. Some bosses will micromanage their employees or helpers to point out to the point where the employee just can't stand it anymore and they quit. In graduate school, I had a part-time professor who taught an evening course. His day job was as a school principal. And I asked him what he did if he wanted to fire a teacher. He said he generally didn't have to fire a teacher. He just micromanaged them to the point they were so miserable they wanted to leave and find a different job. The word he used is, we coach them out. Well, that was very enlightening to me. Well, I'm quite pleased that the school that I work at, where I teach, my principal doesn't play the gotcha game, where the supervisor doesn't look over the shoulder every minute and criticize every tiny misstep that an employee makes, because, we all have those little things that we do that somebody else doesn't exactly see them the way we do. And I've seen some interesting transformations and unusual transformations in some people. The minute you put a badge of authority on them, or some folks instantly then become a dictator because they think that's what bosses are supposed to do. Years ago, at our small company in Oregon, about 12 to 15 employees, I admit that I micromanaged my new employees for the first day or two, sometimes up to a week. But I wanted to make sure they were trained in. They knew what had to be done, and so I was there with them for the first few days to a week. And then I left them alone. They were pretty much autonomous. They did their jobs, they learned how to interact with others, and interact with the customers. And whenever they brought a problem to me, I asked them to bring me at least 2 possible solutions. Eventually they realized that they were empowered to solve the problems on their own, and I really wasn't needed except for some really big or really emergency situation. I like that, when people solve the problems on their own. I occasionally went on business trips for 1 to 3 days. I had several senior employees, but I didn't have anybody established as the number 2 person in the company. So before each trip, I held a staff meeting and I informed the staff which employee was to be in charge while I was away. And I usually ended up by saying, and I will back them up even if they're wrong. That way they knew that they were in charge. And each temporary boss had to be careful how he managed the other employees, because he didn't know who was going to be the boss on the next trip. And whatever rolled around could come around. And so there was a motivation for each of them to be gracious to each other. They simply didn't know who was going to be there in charge next. And so as a result, they were motivated to be kind and to be helpful and forgiving. The word mercy comes to my mind. Well, after we sold the company after about a dozen years, and those 3 senior employees who were quite responsible people, and they had each taken turns being the boss over the years, they each went on to establish their own successful companies. They had learned to serve the needs of others by not lording authority over them. They learned to allow their employees to grow and be responsible decision makers. We're all leaders in our own lives, and then we're leaders in our families and in our communities. And then in our church, our congregation, we're leaders, and then in the church at large. And as we assume greater and greater responsibilities in our own individual spheres of influence, we must take on the cloak of being responsible servants. We don't have to pretend to be lords or masters for our brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. Let's take a look at 1 Peter, what Peter wrote in chapter 5, in 1 Peter 5. And I'm going to go do this one in the King James Version. And he's speaking here to the elders, actually. I'm going to start in 1 Peter 5 and start in verse 1. The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder. So Peter says, I'm an elder, and I'm exhorting you other elders, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. He was there, he saw it, and we know the story. And also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. He's looking forward to the kingdom of God and the participation there. Verse 2, feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, because I have to, right? Or, what does it say? But willingly, not for filthy lucre, meaning because you're going to make big bucks, but of a ready mind, meaning a willing mind. And then note verse 3, and I highlighted it in my notes. Neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. As I've mentioned to others, it's not as if an elder or a minister in charge for having responsibilities in a congregation is like the Norwegian god Thor, and he has a big hammer and lightning bolts come out. Notice that the Apostle Peter emphasizes what we read in the book of Matthew, that we're not to be lords over God's heritage. We're to be examples. This instruction is specifically for elders, but by extension applies to all of us because our destiny, our heritage, is to become priests in the kingdom of God. We look at the books of Luke and Mark, the parallel gospel accounts of that Matthew 20, verses 25 through 27. Let's look at the parallel accounts in Luke 22. Start breaking into verse 25. The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. And he ends that, verse 27, yet I am among you as the one who serves. So this is identifying now, this is Christ's words, that that service is expected as an example. And it's not an empty example because that's expected, frankly, of all of us, is to serve. We take a look at the Mark parallel example in Mark 9. And in Mark 9, and let's break into verse 35. If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Well, we should be servants anyway, okay? So you don't need to have the desire to be the first. And then he goes on to talk about the child that's in the midst of them and treating others very kindly in that way. You see, Mark records Christ explaining the importance of being gentle. He goes on in those verses to, as with a child in his arms, not chasing the child away with harsh commands as if the child were a nuisance. I teach a college class in American government. And in that class, I teach the definition of politics. You want to hold on to the edge of your chairs now, right? Politics is simply this: the process by which people make decisions for a community. I'm going to repeat it. Politics is the process by which people make decisions for a community. That's it. It's really quite simple, actually. Politics itself is neither good nor evil. It's a decision-making process. People can use the political process for good or they can use it for evil. But the definition of politics itself is just a decision-making process. We have politics in our families. We have politics in our neighborhoods, in our cities, our states, our nation, and yes, we even have politics in the church, because politics is how people make decisions for their family or community or their congregation. Whether there's one decision or many decision makers, and whether decisions are for one person or for a group of persons. Could even be for thousands or millions, depending upon the nature of the decision being made. People often think of politics as someone having the rule over us. If there's a strong decision maker over us, then we really don't have to think too much about it or worry about personal responsibility because we'll just let somebody else be responsible. And if somebody else is responsible, then we escape responsibility. If we insist that someone else be the boss, then we can say, well, it's not my fault, it's someone else's job. And in the end, we can either be responsible individually or we can declare ourselves to be victims. At the beginning of every semester in school, I ask my students if they want me to make their decisions for them. Do they want me to decide when to get up in the morning, what to wear, what to eat for breakfast, what classes to take, what to study, how long to study, who their friends are, what they can eat for lunch, if they can participate in after-school activities, if so, for how long, whether they can watch TV, if so, what programs, how long they can watch, can they have a cell phone, can they have the cell phone all the time, can they see a movie, and of course I would pick out the movie, and they would be clear to know that. What type of music can they listen to, and how much? And I emphasize that I'm really a very, very good decision maker. That my children have made wonderful transitions to adulthood. They become persons of accomplishment. And I emphasize to them, as I will do next Monday when they come into my classroom, and I will go over this again. And yet with all of my great experience in decision making, and I emphasize my experience, my education, and my resolve in life on making good decisions, for some reason, these budding teenage students want to make their own decisions in life. This individual decision-making hasn't always been so in the church. Frankly, it's easier to let somebody else make the decisions because then you can have somebody to blame. There's a tendency to want somebody else to be responsible because then what? Then we don't have to be responsible. But we're going to have to show up individually at the judgment seat to be personally accountable. It won't work to point the finger at someone else and say, he or she made my decisions for me. In Romans 14:10, breaking into the verse in Romans 14:10, for we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Similarly, we read when Paul also wrote in Corinthians, to the 2 Corinthians 5:10. Paul wrote again, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. And then what does it say? So each one may receive what's due for what he has done in his body, whether good or evil. So in other words, be accountable for our decisions. It's an individual situation that we must be prepared for. Now remember, Jesus Christ said specifically, not to lord it over, meaning use authority over the brethren as the Gentiles do. God expects each of us to become good decision makers. If we have autocrats, dictators, bosses, and such telling us to do everything, then we become weak decision makers. We must step into the decision-making process ourselves. In Proverbs, in chapter 6, there are several verses that talk about the ant. It says, go to the ant, consider her ways, and be wise. Proverbs 6, starting in verse 6. Ants which have no captain, or overseer, nor ruler. The ant provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. We can each take the initiative, as does the tiny ant, and get things done. As a practical matter, as a pastor, I simply cannot be everywhere and do everything. I rely heavily on each of you for your support, your participation in our congregation, for the administration locally, and the overall mission of the church. So leadership principle number 2, don't lord it over the brethren as the Gentiles do. Now we've covered the 2 don'ts of leadership. Leadership point 1 is don't be a stumbling block, and point 2, don't lord it over the brethren as Gentiles do. Now I want to take a look at the last 2 points, the 2 do's of leadership. And so leadership principle number 3. Leadership principle number 3, there is safety in a multitude of counselors. There's safety in a multitude of counselors. The Church of God in modern history has had its challenges understanding how to manage a church that was expanding rapidly. Those of you that have read about or experienced church history know the problems that grow out of a management style that couldn't keep up with the growth of the church membership. Therefore, many years ago, when I was in short pants, there grew a different management structure was developed, a hierarchical military system with layers of authority. And this new, more centralized authoritarian system became the cultural norm for the church for decades. However, this centralized authoritarian structure did not have the checks and balances on human nature. And God allowed us to learn some things the hard way. We'll see advice from the scriptures that anticipates the weakness of man when he is left to his own devices, and how an individual can go astray, and if he or she doesn't have the advice of a number of counselors. And as you may have recalled 20-some years ago, when some church members heard someone in authority tell them they no longer had to keep the Sabbath or had to avoid unclean foods or meats, these people immediately began to do what? Eat pork, drink shrimp cocktails, and disregard the Sabbath. They simply obeyed someone else without taking personal responsibility for following God. We follow the leadership of the church, which is the inerrant word, which is Christ expressing himself through the Bible. Some people want to be told everything what to do. And some people are quite willing to tell others what to do. Kind of fits together that way. There's some of both kind. We see that in the world as well, in the political system around the world. But it really boils down to that we have to develop our own character to make decisions. We can't play victim and blame everyone else. We will appear before God for our decisions. We can't lay the blame off because we gave our decisions to someone else. At the founding of the United Church of God over 20 years ago, the elders gathered together to preserve the fundamental beliefs of the church. Together they labored with the support of the many congregations around the country and around the world. And these elders formed the United Church of God using the principles revealed in Proverbs 11, verse 14. In Proverbs 11, verse 14. I like to commit this one to memory. Where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety. Where there's no counsel, the people fall, but in multitude of counselors there is safety. Well, a counselor is an advisor. No one individual is going to be entrusted to lead the fellowship astray. Instead, a system of checks and balances has been put in place to ensure that a multitude of counselors would manage the temporal affairs of the church. Therefore, all of the elders of the church from around the world vote annually to elect 12 members on a rotational basis, meaning 4 each year to serve 3-year terms. And those council of elders become the governing body of governing board of UCG. Each elder from around the world becomes one of those many counselors referred to in Proverbs 11:14. There is safety in a multitude of counselors. However, the multitude of counselors safety principle doesn't stop there. The COE, the Council of Elders, the governing board of directors of the church, has committees, and the committees have subcommittees to assist with the work of the church. The Council of Elders carefully selects a president who serves a term of 3 years. The president selects his various operations managers and asks the Council of Elders for advice and approval for the appointment of each of those operations managers. And again, there's safety in a multitude of counselors. This pattern is expected to be followed throughout the United Church of God as a governing style of collaboration and mutual submission under God. Well, what happens if collaboration doesn't occur? I think we've seen it. From time to time, Proverbs 15:22 tells us what happens if you do not collaborate or you do not bring or get counsel, a multitude of counsel. Proverbs 15:22, without counsel, plans go awry, but in the multitude of counselors they're established. In other words, it makes things happen. There is a natural consequence when the multitude of counselors are not sought, and that natural consequence is generally a problem, or as the proverb states, plans go awry. Things can get messed up. Decisions are sometimes made in a hurry without adequate advice. When more people are involved, there's a better chance to avoid the complications that arise because the decision maker may not have had all the information, no matter how big or how little the issue may be. I welcome your input as I hope you welcome mine. We're all in this together as God has entrusted all of us with the measure of responsibility for this congregation. So leadership principle number 3, there is safety in a multitude of counselors. Leadership principle number 4, be helpers of others' joy. Leadership principle 4, be helpers of others' joy. We catch this in 2 Corinthians 1:24. Again, the Apostle Paul writing to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians 1:24. Notice how he says this and how this dovetails with not lording it over the brethren. What does it say? Not that we have dominion over your faith, but are fellow workers for your joy, for by faith you stand. So he's talking about fellow workers for helping others, fellow workers for their joy. If we take a look at that same verse in the King James, it says, we are helpers, also says we are helpers of your joy. And in the New King James, it says we are fellow workers for your joy. We're in this together. We're to serve together. We're to help together. So if we take a look now at these first 3 principles of leadership, don't be a stumbling block. Don't lord it over the others. There's safety in a multitude of counselors then. It leads us to this point 4, that we're to be helpers of joy. So for a moment, I want to flash back to the very first verse that we did, I believe, or one of the first ones in Matthew 20, starting in verse 25 through 27. So let's flash back to that one in Matthew 20. And remember we talked about, or the scripture says that whoever, that we should not be like the Gentiles, lording it over others or exercising dominion. But it says, let him be your minister. And whoever would be chief among you, let him be your servant, or also translated as slave. A servant for what? Notice the verse in 27 that we're to be servants to our brethren. How can we best help them? Let's ask ourselves. How can we best help them within our ability to do so? Because if we're not a stumbling block to others, if we diligently work to avoid offending or creating a problem for others, if we avoid lording it over the brethren, if we serve our brothers and sisters in Christ, and we ask for their input, for their participation, if we're their partners, then we are active helpers of their joy. I'm very proud of this congregation. A couple of years ago, maybe more, Mr. Barron was in the hospital, and our then pastor, Mr. Welch, was surprised when he came to a visit on a Sunday afternoon. The biggest surprise was that over that afternoon, all 22 people in the congregation came to see him. Mr. Welch told me he had never known an entire congregation to come into one hospital room at one time, on one day to visit. Now, I understand that we can't all make it every time somebody is there in those circumstances. It was just kind of all worked out that way. But I'm glad everybody did, because it was all done voluntarily. Nobody called up and said, you really have to do this. Each person took the responsibility of the leadership of one to be helpers of someone's joy. If we take a look at the term pastor, it's very similar to the word shepherd. I have a flock of sheep at home. It's a small flock, about a dozen sheep in home. And as their shepherd, I move the sheep from pasture to pasture. I have the pastures divided out. You might say, so they can get the best grass in one, and then when that's grazed down, they go to the next one, and so forth. You might say I lead them to green pastures. It's my hope and expectation that I'm used by God to lead this congregation to green pastures. But as we get led to the pastures, bear in mind we each have to consume our own food. Each of the sheep must eat and drink their fill, and as a flock, by instinct, we do best when we stick together, we eat together, we watch out for each other. So, if we look at the 4 leadership principles, we're going to, number 1, avoid being a stumbling block. Number 2, don't lord it over the brethren. Number 3, there's safety in a multitude of counselors. And number 4, be helpers of their joy. Every individual in the congregation can be exercising all 4 of these principles of leadership. The 2 don'ts and the 2 do's don't rely on a person at the moment who happens to have the title of pastor. Ultimately, it isn't what God expects of us, is found in Micah 6:8. I'm not going to turn there. I think you've already known it. To do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. To do justly looks like don't be a stumbling block, okay, to others. No guile. To love mercy sounds a lot like don't lord it over the brethren. Be forgiving and kind. And as well as safety in a multitude of counselors. And to walk humbly with our God is to be helpers of their joy. In our fellowship in United Church of God, there are only two kinds of titles. There's elders and then deacons or deaconesses. And that's it. We have a very flat organizational structure. We have checks and balances that is designed through a constitution and bylaws in the United Church of God. We have a collaborative decision-making process and through the General Conference of Elders, all the elders in the world. We have a process for policy making and administration that the church might be scripturally organized. In 1 Corinthians 14, and some of you may have memorized this one, 1 Corinthians 14:40, let all things be done decently and in order. So from time to time, we'll ask that things be done in a particular order so that we can follow this scripture, so it's not wonderment what should come next. The rest of the jobs that we hear or we see listed in Ephesians 4, starting in Ephesians 4:11, are not particularly titles in the church, but they're functions within the church. In Ephesians 4:11, he gave himself some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God. We even read about prophesying in Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 14, about evangelizing, teaching, and preaching. Well, these are functions, not offices. We're all on the front lines for evangelizing. For it's our example, whether good or otherwise, that influences people's opinion of the church as we carry forward the gospel message. One final comment. The four principles discussed today are essential to recognize, support, and practice good leadership. But how do we put these points into practice? Because they all sound good in the air, but how do we actually use them? Most of us, I presume, are familiar with the television game show Jeopardy! And that's where the contestants ask everything in the form of a question. They answer in the form of a question. Well, here are some of the questions that we can use to avoid creating stumbling blocks, avoid wanting to lord it over others, or avoid seeking a multitude of counselors, or avoid being helpers of others' joy. And you can make your own list. I just have a few of the comments here. Was it 3, 6, about 8 or 9? One question we can ask is, would you like to, ... Or how about, would you help me? ? May I help you? How about this, ... Is it okay if? I can review it. What about blank? Could we blank, or would you blank? So, would you like to is an easy question to ask, how to put it into practice. Would you help me? Or could you help me? Sometimes they would, but they couldn't. May I help you? That works. Because some people won't ask. And so sometimes we have to step in and ask them. Or how about this? Offering a solution or a suggestion. How about this? Is it okay if? Meaning granting them some respect if it's within their world of influence. Is it okay if we do this? What about this? Or how about this? Is it okay if? Another way of saying that. In other words, do I have your support? Do I have your encouragement? Or are you going to be, is there any objection to it? What about blank? Okay, what about that? And then could we? Well, maybe we could, maybe we shouldn't, but we could. But we can explore this as part of the multitude of counselors. And the last one I have is would you? Sometimes things don't get done because we fail to ask. So I pose these questions, and I'm sure there's many more ways to put into practice these leadership principles. I want to thank you all for deeply for your love and support. We all have an important work to do as we preach the gospel and we build up God's people. May God watch over each one of us, encourage us as we follow him.